Розвиток соціальних мереж дало великий поштовх поняттям дезінформації та фейк-ньюз в різних сферах соціальної та політичної діяльності. Про широку роль фальшивої інформації детальніше розповість директор інституту disinfowatch.org, знаний у нашій громаді Маркус Колга.
Дорогі глядачі, маємо гарну можливість тепер поговорити з паном Маркус Колга, який є аналітик глобальних справ і який дуже багато розуміється в справах фальшивої інформації. Mr. Kolga, Marcus, welcome to our show. And we have very intense global atmosphere right now with Ukraine, the armies of Ukraine, all the politics surrounding it. To what extent do you think the talk about disinformation, about fake news, plays a role in this Ukrainian picture today?
Well, first of all, Yuri, thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for all the great work that you're doing with KONTAKT in Canada. I mean, it's such an important channel to communicate with the Canadian-Ukrainian community. The situation right now is, of course, incredibly intense. We've talked many times before, you and I, about the role of the Kremlin's disinformation and information warfare, targeting, Ukraine, the Central and Eastern European countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but also Canada, and the efforts by the Kremlin to use information warfare, false news, false narratives, to manipulate Canadian policy on Ukraine and towards the entire Central and Eastern European region and NATO itself. And, we're seeing some of that manifest itself right now. It's intensifying, of course, and it has intensified over the past 6 months. The narratives that we're seeing are some of the classic ones that not just the Ukrainian community, but like, again, I said it earlier, the entire Central and Eastern European community, that our communities are run by some sort of neo-Nazis, fascists, that the Ukrainian community in Canada controls Canadian foreign policy. I'm sure that you wish that it would, but unfortunately, that's not happening. And these are narratives that were promoted by the Kremlin during the Cold War. The Soviets used these narratives quite intensely in the 60s and 70s. The problem with them, especially this narrative about the Ukrainian community controlling Canada's foreign policy, or the Central and Eastern European communities in general, is that what it does, it promotes division. It seeks to marginalize and silence a very important Canadian ethnic community. And it does sow hate. And the sad thing is that we're seeing some of these narratives emerge from, some former diplomats, some academics, and other commentators, even in mainstream media. And I think that Canadian media, Canadian elected officials, and others need to be aware that these sorts of narratives are floating around, that they need to be dismissed. Because they're simply untrue. And again, they're promoting division and hate towards a specific ethnic community. The Central and Eastern European communities in Canada have just as much right to comment on any sort of Canadian issue, whether it's foreign policy or domestic issues, as any other Canadian, whether it's old Anglo-Saxon Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, or the newest Canadian immigrants. These Kremlin narratives and what I call cognitive warfare against our country is intensifying, and it's really concerning watching it happen.
To what extent, like you've shifted over to the Canadian scene? I've heard that the disinformation concept is there to destabilize the community, to create anarchy, create uncertainty. To what extent do you think there is a fake news narrative to, let's say, the vaccine situation or even the convoy situation that we just had in Canada?
Well, there's no doubt that it plays a role. You bring up a very good point. What is the objective of this sort of ultimate objective of foreign disinformation, specifically Kremlin disinformation and cognitive warfare targeting Canada? And it is the polarization of society. What these propagandists do, whether it's at the Russian embassy in Ottawa or in Moscow, they identify very divisive, very polarizing issues. You bring up vaccinations. This is a fertile ground for Russian disinformation because of its divisive properties. They've sunk their fangs into this, and they already did that early on in the pandemic. And it's not the first time. We know that the Russian government and Russian state media platforms and those aligned with them have promoted anti-vaccine narratives about polio vaccines and chickenpox vaccines, all sorts of various different vaccines, because it's those people who believe in anti-vax theories, conspiracy theories, many of them, are emotional about them, and this is one thing that the Russian government is very good at when it comes to disinformation. It is tapping into those emotions, and really shaking them up and agitating them. And so I think that Canadians need to be aware that when there are these divisive issues that come up, we should be aware that the foreign governments, including the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Iranian government, will exploit those divisions in those specific issues. And I've also been keeping a very close eye on these trucker protests. I mean, this is a perfect situation for the Russian government to try and exploit those divisions. And I think that those who are involved in this protest need to be very aware of that. I'm sure there are some very good people who are just angry and are, trying to protest for what they believe is their right to not be vaccinated, which is fine. And we are allowed to do that in this country. But they need to be aware that their political views and their motivations may be hijacked by foreign governments and used against them and used against Canadians in the long run.
Could we, Marcus, shift back to the Ukrainian situation and and how it affects the Baltic countries? What's your assessment coming from that point of view?
Well, look, what the Russian government right now is trying to do, one of their prime narratives is that that NATO made some sort of a commitment in the early 1990s not to expand the alliance, not to enlarge the alliance in an eastward direction. That means that the membership of the Baltic states and all the other Central and Eastern European countries that are involved and members right now, that it would invalidate their membership. This is nonsense. There was a conversation that was held between U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev in the sidelines of a conference in the early 1990s, in which James Baker told Mikhail Gorbachev that in the context of German reunification, that NATO would not move eastward inside of Germany. Mikhail Gorbachev later said in 2014, in an interview, nonetheless, with Russian state media, that the topic of NATO expansion had never come up. He never brought it up. It had never come up with any of his Western counterparts. And so debunking this Kremlin narrative that NATO had made some sort of a commitment not to expand eastward. Furthermore, this, when we talk about Ukraine, I think one of the things that Canadians need to understand is that it's the sovereign right of every single nation, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Canada for that matter, to make its own decisions about its security arrangements and alliances. Ukraine is a country that is democratic. It is aspiring to become a Western democracy. We know that there have been issues with corruption in the past. It wants to clean those issues up. And I think Ukrainians want to be as prosperous as their European neighbors. The Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles made this decision early on and asked for NATO's help to provide protection to allow them to do that completely. And that's what they've been doing over the past, 30 years or so. Ukraine wants the same. And so this sort of Russian disinformation about NATO expansion is intended to derail Ukraine's sovereign aspirations. And I think that Canada and its allies need to be very much aware of this and ensure that when making policy-related decisions, that they reject this sort of disinformation regarding their security.
Okay, well, Marcus, thank you very much for joining us today. Дорогі глядачі, це була розмова з паном Marcus Kolga, який розглядає глобальні світові проблеми. І сьогодні ми говорили про справу fake news. Повертаємося до програми відразу після цих реклам. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Yuri.